Good to see you.
Awesome.
Thanks for reaching out. It's good to see you.
Yes, likewise, for sure. Well, we're going to get right into it, Mr. Sam. So, thank you for joining us here on Clay's Council. You are our second guest of this show. I just launched the show earlier this month and all. So, I'm definitely very excited and thrilled to have you on this morning.
I'm thrilled to be here and honored. Thank you very much.
That's my absolute pleasure. So, Sam, if you could just tell our audiences just who you are and what exactly is Place Public Affairs, which you've just launched recently as of this year.
I did launched as of a couple weeks ago, actually. Yeah, to your point, it's something I've been thinking about for a while. In my background, I spent my life in politics. I grew up quite literally around campaigns. My father worked for the Carter administration in every campaign through Obama Biden. He actually worked for President Biden as well. And I remember I had these crazy memories of being on a tarmac in Quincy, Illinois, wrapped up in Rosalind Carter's fur coat, thinking that that was normal. It's not normal, but really, I think from a young age was really encouraged with the idea that we are our brother's keeper, and to go out of your way to make sure that those around you have what they need, and those around you that the system is set up to fail have what they need. So long story short on that is effectively when I was 19, started doing advance for President Clinton, and then gradually moved into a more full-time role, took a full-time position in the Clinton administration, and actually as a political appointee at the Pentagon for the Navy's news desk. And then that was it. I think at some point I thought I would go back home to Missouri where I grew up. And, it's been a little under 30 years since then, and I'm still doing it. So as far as my background, I've been blessed to be able to work for 3 U.S. presidents, 6 presidential campaigns, a whole bunch in between. And now the idea of place public affairs, really the idea of place, of what defines a person and their story, where they are, and where they are is somewhat physical and somewhat metaphysical. The geographic factors where a person grows up affects their views on the world, but the effects of their family and their culture and what happens, the zeitgeist that happens to them throughout their life really defines their place in the world and how they view their place in the world and where they want to be in the world. So it's a pretty powerful sentiment that the more I thought about it, the more folks encouraged me to actually launch my own firm focused on this, because it's something I've believed in for my whole life. It all came together quickly, and I'm really excited. And to your point, just a little more context. I remember being in Philly in 2008 for President Obama, then Senator Obama for the campaign, and Mayor Nutter and Governor Rendell pulled our team aside and said, "Look, you cannot do one giant rally in Philly. That's not Philly. Philly is broken up in different neighborhoods, entirely different communities that have vastly different and disparate lived experiences. And if you have one rally in one place, you're going to ostracize everybody else." And we endeavored to have 4 separate rallies, and 60,000 people showed up across 4 different rallies in one day. I think it was over 6 hours, which just still blows my mind. But that really got me thinking about the power of place and realizing he showed up in these places where people live and where their experiences are defined, and it was very, very powerful. Every single place was packed. One was a street corner in front of a diner. One was a 4-way stop where they shut the streets down. One was a football field. But that really got me on the path to the power of place. And 8 years in the Obama administration and six and a half, 7 years in the agency space, it's come full circle. So I'm excited.
That sounds very good. Thank you for sharing that, Sam, about your background and your journey that led you to establish Place Public Affairs. If you could just share and elaborate with our audiences who may not understand, what is the concept of an advance person? Obviously, this coming from your background, that's basically essentially how I found you. You did serve as an advance individual or advanced strategist. Could you just explain what that role is exactly for those who may be wondering what that means, or who might kind of struggle to understand what that whole concept is as relates to campaigns or to a presidential administration?
No, of course. It's kind of like being a political roadie, being the team that jumps ahead before the Foo Fighters or Bon Jovi and sets up all the Tahoe Lamb with those two references. But jumps ahead and sets up all the logistics, but it's much more um, deep and full of diplomacy and communication strategy than that, because at the end of the day, you're jumping ahead to set up the logistics and the relationships for someone who either is in a position of influence that helps move policy forward, that can help people, that can help communities that you believe should be helped, or they're running for a position to be able to do that. It can be domestically. I've traveled all over the world for President Obama and Biden and Clinton, and the amount of diplomacy that goes into that is incredible, because to set all the logistics up and set up bilat meetings and have agreements on both sides and do it in a way that once your principles actually show up, there are no diplomatic hurdles. There's no rough emotions or feelings because one side didn't get what they want and the other side has the upper hand. So it's a mix of diplomacy to make sure that you don't burn any bridges in the process and leave a wake behind you, and then also done in a way that for a rally or for a town hall or for a policy speech, back to the concept of place, the place, more on the nose, the actual physical location, is really, really important as well. I mean, having 15 people show up to a farm to sit on hay bales for a conversation, a fireside chat about agriculture policy, or having nurses and doctors and caregivers and patient advocates come to a hospital system to talk about the need for more equitable access to healthcare. Um, the venue is just as important. It should reflect the very nature of what you're trying to move forward. So, advance is this mix of a joke that all my advanced friends have ADHD, including myself. But your adaptability quotient and your emotional intelligence is significantly high, because you've done so many different things in different places and met so many people that you start to really develop a sense of what kind of a place or what kind of a story in storytelling can move people towards a purpose. In this case, moving more equitable access to policies forward.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Sam. I definitely can relate having ADHD myself there. But Mr. Sam, if you could just elaborate a little more, how do you believe storytelling could can be utilized to affect change as well as shaping public discourse, particularly concerning issues relevant to women and marginalized communities? Obviously, those are huge voting blocks this cycle, and obviously the last several cycles, to be quite frank. If you could just provide a little more elaborate discussion on that, as far as in the areas of storytelling being utilized to affecting change and shaping that public discourse concerning those areas.
Of course, I mean it cannot be overstated the power and the importance of storytelling. It's the bridge between human experience and written or spoken word. And when you read something or you process something and it doesn't come with that emotion or come with some context, you might process it to some degree and digest it and remember it down the line, but you're really, really going to remember it if it actually came through the experience of someone who lived that and why they are hoping the world will become a better place and more accessible for them. So from a story perspective, I mean it you cannot move policy forward or move policy makers in a direction, or for that matter, and this can be applied across the corporate space as well. Public affairs, the affairs of the public, so to speak, is largely focused on policy, but there's a business component as well. B2B sourcing, companies that use vendors or companies that themselves are considering social purpose. Storytelling and having examples from human beings who have lived experience or know those and love those that have lived experience. It can't be overstated. And an example, one of my previous clients, we set up it was called 24/7. It was a around the clock, essentially storytelling apparatus over digital and some in person to effectively move members of Congress forward around the gun legislation that was passed in mid 2023 after Uvalde. And the concept was that it'd been 30 years until since any significant policy had been moved forward on that front, and to give the policymakers effectively a pretty significant push, but also air cover. So if talks broke down in real time, they knew, well, they're hearing regularly from conservatives and Democrats and human beings across the entire country who no longer had those partisan stripes. They were people that were affected by gun violence,
Right.
either themselves directly or their family members. But those stories, it's the power of those we heard constantly from inside Congress, that as they were hearing those, it would cause members to, when they would almost break down, come back and realize we can't not do this. We have to move this forward. So, hearing from a human being and having that bridge between the human experience and, again, spoken word or written word, it's an amplifier. Look at the fourth industrial revolution, and now what we're looking at in AI in the fifth industrial revolution. You can talk about the demarcations that caused the industrial revolutions over the past centuries, and beginning with fire and now through to AI and steam along the way and computers. You can talk about the science of that, but if you talk about examples of how the human element and the human experience is what caused that to happen, and then the innovation that came from lots of different perspectives and different stories that effectively got to supercharging those processes forward. The stories are what contextualize it in a way that just makes it so much more memorable and so much more powerful. So I'm answering your question. I feel like I'm
Absolutely.
going too far down the rabbit hole.
Oh, no, no, no. This is perfect. So Sam, just given that, as far as you just mentioned AI and just new forms of new forms of media and storytelling. Obviously, we're on a podcast now. Just right out the gate for this particular election year and cycle, how will you take charge of either using these new forms of media? Obviously, you're on a new form of media right now, but just those new forms of media when it comes to the storytelling aspect as well as AI. How will you, or if you will, incorporate it into your strategies at all with public affairs or combat against it if it comes to misinformation or misinformation or disinformation, given your capacity?
Of course, I mean, the answer is yes to both, and to all for that matter. And I think the new forms of technology, we used to call it new media back in the mid 2000s, and now that new media is is somewhat archaic compared to the development since then, ironically. But using the newer channels obviously is critical to reach populations that use those channels is more of a staple. TikTok is a great example of it's much more digestible and short form. At everyone having a very accessible conduit to absorb something in 7 to 15 seconds versus have to watch a 5 minute political video or a 5 minute ad for that matter. So the newer channels and reaching Gen Z and millennials in a lot of ways in an attention span effectively that grew up in an era of digital and an era of connectivity which has never existed ever prior to now is important. I hear a lot about the bad around AI. I mean, there is a specter around artificial intelligence, but at the end of the day, it's artificial intelligence is a bit of a misnomer. It's not an intelligence that's going to take over the world. It's an intelligence that's based on data flow, and the human element is what pilots it. Um, from a process perspective, because of all the data that is coming at all of us constantly, and that's so small compared to as it ramps up over the next 5 to 10 years, how much more data that's going to come at us. I think AI is going to be a transformative effect in being able to distill that data down into and make better decisions. And that's not just in campaigns and motivating a person off the couch to go stand in line to vote. That's national security decisions. That's our global competitive edge over other countries, and also our competitive edge financially to be able to lift up our own communities in the U.S. So I think AI, if it's there will be examples. There have been, and there will be examples of the negative outcomes. But I think the positive outcomes will be far greater. Especially as people realize the power that it will allow us to reach more people more quickly. But while we're on the idea of those channels, I think the most important thing in public affairs that I try to get across to influencers and clients as I'm speaking to them is that as much as the new channels are important, the efficacy and the applicability of the channel is more important than how new and how shining it is. And by that, I mean, for communities that are geographically underserved, radio is still
Yep.
it's city. And for communities where you're trying to go in and make a difference as a, let's say, a corporate CEO or a head of community purpose and investment from a Fortune 500 brand trying to go into, I live in DC, into inner city DC, into Ward 7 or Ward, any of the wards for that matter, outside of downtown, and try to help, so to speak, and inject money into the community and more access to food for food deserts and more access to pharmacy care, more access to effectively services that human beings need and don't have access to because the system is set up to fail them. That channel needs to include showing up, and not just physically showing up to a community meeting, showing up with someone you've already met, doing your research, figuring out who the community influences are, figuring out who in the community people trust. And it could be a preacher, it could be a basketball coach, it could be a former mayor or a former precinct captain. And it doesn't even need to be the one that teaches the kids in that community basketball. By nature of having that position as someone who is trusted within in the community, you validate yourself into that community. And to go in without that in that channel, physically in community meetings or using newsletters or using radio, if you don't have that validator effect where people in the room, so to speak, look at you and see a person they trust and say, okay, well, I have lived experience that shows me I should not trust this person, but I trust that person. So
Right.
I'm going to give them a chance. Maybe this person actually does have the best of intentions. So the channels are important. The new channels are important, but leveraging all the channels in a way that will reach people where they are effectively and having validator effects through humans and examples of your own goodwill and your own ability to take down barriers it is without those you can have the shiniest of objects for your channels to reach your community for GOTV or getting consumers to buy a brand and it's not going to matter.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you there. Now, you did mention earlier, and that's about radio. Do you still feel in 2024 that public radio could be an effective tool, just given everything that you have just outlined?
Clay, I'm sorry you cut out for a second. The internet where I am is a little.
Absolutely. Yeah, let me repeat myself. Do you think that public radio, you just mentioned radio, do you think that public radio could still serve as an important pivotal vehicle in this particular cycle this year?
Yes, full stop. And it's again, my background is in politics and advocacy, but also communications and public affairs, and it's from a client perspective, associations, political campaigns, government. For all of those, yes. Now it also depends on where you are. If you're in Manhattan, it's going to be less of a tool that you would leverage as a staple. But if you're where I grew up in rural Northeast Missouri, my family still farms a century farm there, and the closest cities are St. Louis, Des Moines, and Kansas City, and they're all 3 hours away.
Right.
You have to use radio to show up. And that's not just to get people to vote. That's an education campaign. That's to educate people for voting day, for election day, where to go, form a plan. The precincts have changed. For early vote, even though in the general there are 35 places to vote, in early vote there are three. Last year, you received a mail-in ballot. This year, the legislature changed the rules, and now you're not going to receive it. You have to actually reach out and request it with your county government. All of those aspects, inspiring a person to get off the couch and vote, or to form a plan, or to move towards a brand. If you're using radio, depending on where you are, yes, it's definitely a necessity, and I think all across different regions it is, but especially in rural America.
Perfect. I completely agree with you wholeheartedly. I still think there is a good place, a good strategy for public radio in 2024 and even beyond that. Now, given that we're both very fluent in this subject matter, could you just explain the differences to our audiences who may not be, the differences between public affairs, government affairs, public relations, and grassroots and community affairs? The reason why I bring that up is because I think they all perfectly play a good role in obviously getting constituents and citizens activated into not just vote, but even staying engaged. If you could just, to the best of your abilities, explain the differences between community and grassroots affairs, government relations or affairs, public affairs or relations.
Of course, in many ways, there's a Venn diagram there where they're all kind of intertwined in some ways, and it can get confusing because you hear public affairs, the affairs of the public, and public relations, and relating with the public, and it kind of seems like the same thing. And in some
Yeah.
instances, it is. Um, in my experience in campaigns and over the years working for clients in communications and public affairs, it's more about who you're trying to move. If you're trying to move a policy maker, either to have them realize that something they're pursuing isn't necessarily what their constituents think they should be doing, even if they thought that that's the case. Um, that's a matter of leveraging government affairs to reach out to them directly and talk about the affairs of the government. And public affairs is a tool to reach out to the public to, again, activate them, to give them a voice, to reach out to their members, their policymakers at the state level or the federal level, to tell them. The channels to do that, we just talked about some earned media, letter to the editor, an op-ed. That can be a direct letter, having a constituent literally just send a letter to their member of Congress, that chief of staff, and their legislative director, potentially a larger subset around where they live. Um, and it gets a little wonky when you start talking about grass tops and grassroots, but in some ways that is its own ecosystem because then you're really getting into place. You're getting into what drives a person and what makes them fear, what makes them love. Is it their tractor cab? Is it their church? Is it their tech job? Is it the kitchen they cook in? Is it the kids that they look at? Is it their own parents? All those factors from a grassroots perspective. I have this really nerdy analogy that I
Sure.
just I can't get past. That if you look at it as a human, as a blade of grass, and imagine them as they rise up, as that blade rises up through the course of their life, all of the factors that affect them are around them. It's more nuanced now given digital and given all these different other factors from a systemic racism and systemic barrier perspective. But at the end of the day, where they are, those experiences are really what drive them. So if you can find those common experiences in a large swath of grass, many human beings, and have them all activate at once, policymakers will take notice. That's grassroots. That's finding commonalities and in a lot of ways using digital or using an influencer in the community to have everyone stand up and say something at a forum or a phone call. Back to the idea of grassroots and grass tops advocacy, the grass tops aspect of that are not so much the people that are more important at the top of the grass, but the people that have a view over all of the grass. And that can be someone who is an elected official, but it can also, again, be the pastor at a church. It can be a pit master. It can be a coach. It can be someone who either has chosen to step into a community role or was pushed into a community role. The head of a cattlemen's association, the head of a Baptist church across a county. I mean, those are the grass tops influencers because they either serve large groups of people or advocate on behalf of large groups of people. And those two things together become very powerful when a policymaker hears from somebody they trust and a bunch of people that voted for them or should vote for them and makes them wonder, wait a minute, maybe I shouldn't be pursuing this, or wait a minute, maybe I should look affairs aspect again. Then there are amplifier effects that come in from all around. The government affairs aspect, reaching directly out to policymakers, either as a lobbyist or indirect lobbying through some of these channels. Um, and then the digital can't be overstated as well. Digital and storytelling flow through all of that. And the digital conversation is a whole other conversation to have. But
Yeah.
I mean, that's a mix of taking, for instance, a piece of earned media and wrapping it into a banner ad to make sure that five people that have to see it. That's making sure that the contextualization you have, again, from a story perspective, is used in a way that is most effective within the channel. If it's radio and you can actually get a farmer on talk radio or public radio to make sure that the person that they are trying to reach hears it, or have that person write a letter with their own story, or have it be short form, 15-second video on TikTok. Um, I come back to storytelling throughout all of those. I hope I answered your question about the ecosystem.
Absolutely.
Back to storytelling. Um, you can inject as much fuel into all those channels that you want, but if you don't have the storytelling and the contextualized experience, the human experience, it won't move forward. But even beyond that, if you think about policymakers and think about implicit bias that all humans have, sometimes not even realizing that they have unconscious bias, sometimes they need to hear a story from a different perspective as well. I heard an analogy the other day about how in America, perhaps across the world, but in America, obviously, ageism is a huge thing. People over a certain age There's an assumption that they're slower. There's an assumption that they're not quite as sharp, or there's an assumption that they don't care as much anymore to work hard. All these different things that we've all heard, or potentially even thought ourselves and not realized it. If you flip that narrative and that story to momentum and ramping up like a race car, and they've had more time to ramp up and go faster, it pushes past that implicit bias and makes a person go, "Oh, I hadn't thought about it that way." So again, the storytelling can be wielded in so many different ways to motivate a person to go towards something. And real quick to touch on that, I've said a couple times to motivate a person off of the couch, and that's GOTV, get out the vote. If you think about elections where the polling showed that large groups of people said, "Yes, I'm going to vote for that person," and election night they lost. It's a very different thing for someone to say and truly believe, "I'm going to vote for that person," to vote, get a babysitter, stand in the rain, perhaps for 4 hours, maybe not be able to afford a babysitter, maybe not be able to afford to leave your job, to actually stand in line to vote. That motivation and that storytelling and that effectively eliciting an emotional reaction in a person to make them not just, okay, I'll go vote, but think, I have to do this. I have to do this for the betterment of my entire community, my family, myself. It's a very different thing. And the things that we're talking about, storytelling and contextualizing and using the right channels, that's what gets to that. That's what motivates and inspires a person to go towards something, whether it's voting or buying or advocating.
I certainly appreciate that, Sam. I do thank you for sharing those effective strategies for fostering inclusivity and diversity in public affairs initiatives, as well as just explaining the navigation of the intersection of public affairs and community engagement, especially when working with underrepresented groups. Could you share a more direct, memorable example of a project or campaign where storytelling played a pivotal role in achieving your objectives? You obviously given some great strategies, but just if you could share a more direct example of that that comes to mind.
Of course, I mean, I talked about the one before. I mean, I've had clients where I'll give you an example from a client that I had during the height of the swirl of COVID, the supply chain issues, and how, I mean, obviously the specter of death of yourself or a family member was the one of the biggest fears that we were dealing with. But at one point, if you remember back when it was at the craziest of, there was a fear there wasn't going to be meat or milk or eggs or lettuce or just access to food in stores. And one of my clients was a meat processing plant that was essentially being hit from all sides from policymakers. One side saying, you're terrible, you kill animals, you're evil, you should go. And now you're not treating your workforce fairly. You're making them come in. You're going to give them all COVID. And the other side saying, you're not doing enough. Why aren't you producing more meat? To really bridge that gap and have both sides stop and say, "Oh, I hadn't thought about it that way." We went in and we found their employees. We worked with them to find people that were being essentially framed as having to go into the office and having to be exposed to COVID for 10, 12 hours at a time. And rather than the company saying, "No, that's not the case," we had the people say it. We had them say, "No, no, this company's putting food on my table because I still have my job." And they're being very, very cautious. There's plexiglass up. We all stand 10 or 15 feet apart. Um, and then having other validators like local academies to say the same thing or relay what those human beings were saying. Without the stories, it would have been the company saying it themselves. And when a company that has a vested interest in profit or in power speaks on their own behalf, there is an assumption of cynicism. Maybe it shouldn't be that way, but at the end of the day, they have their own likes, their own interests, their own needs in that. So there's an assumption that they have ulterior motives. When a human being with a contextualized story stands up and says the very same thing, the people that company is trying to reach stop. And again, they think, well, I had no idea that a farmer would think that. And then they start to think, how many other farmers, they heard from one farmer, but they start to think about how many other farmers in my district think that. Is this a thing? I had no idea. And then they start going out into the community and leveraging public affairs to figure out if that's real or not. And that's where the ecosystem we talked about before really comes into play as an amplifier effect versus just getting one worker and one head of an association to hit on TV that evening, or an op-ed or a direct letter. But the stories, again, we were able to turn the tide and get people from both sides to give them a bit of space so they can continue ramping up and actually produce meat for the rest of the country. Um, and on, from a campaign perspective, I talked about the filibuster for gun safety before. I mean, again, one example of us to contextualize that further. After we won in 2008, I was working at the inaugural, running the media logistics for the events, and about 2 weeks out, I talked to Alyssa Master in the White House about where to end up, and I really wanted to go to education because I'd heard so many things about Arnie Dunn, and how he really, really wanted to transform education and make it more accessible. Well, fast forward 7 years, I was his first scheduling and advance director, and then I was White House liaison at education for 6 years. And the things that I got to do with him, the places I got to go, I mean, it can't be overstated. But something that he was and continues to be incredibly passionate about is gun safety and getting guns off the streets. He's actually back in Chicago now doing that, for the Emerson Collective, and he was the first person that came to DC. And um, sorry, that was a hard and a fabulous client to work for, the gun safety filibuster. But he got up, and I'd seen that man in so many meetings, staunch and committed and unfettering, never back down, but also do it in a diplomatic way. And he got up with kids from Chicago Cred, which is his community organization in Chicago, and he began to weep
Oh, wow.
and tell his story, and growing up on the streets of Chicago and having his friends in the African American community protect him and take him in and say, no, he's okay. He's one of us. He cares. He's an ally. And they began to die from um, essentially gunfire. And his story, and that story, for policymakers, every one of which who knew him and began to weep, was a huge vault forward in having policymakers realize, okay, well, we have to do this. It could take us another month, but we have to do this. Not that it was just on his shoulders, but then his members from Chicago Cred started telling their stories as well. It just was, without the story, without them saying it themselves, it would have been me saying it, and or it would have been my client saying it, or it would have been somebody in Congress saying it, and it would have been like, oh, that's really special, or that's really powerful. But having him do it and tell his own story in a contextualized, emotional way, it was so powerful. And that's, again, why I always come back to storytelling and contextualizing a person's background and their story is so important, and less of an example and more about just taking this a little further with the example. I
Sure.
just somebody who's a former cabinet secretary and an influencer that everybody in DC knows. But you can take a human being in a state anywhere who has a story, because everyone has a story, and you find a way to contextualize. I don't even mean other communities of color, other women, or other LGBTQ. I mean other people that have experiences that are similar because they've gone through the same lived experiences. And you contextualize that in a way that a policymaker, again, will see it. Anyone can become an influencer and through that. It doesn't just have to be somebody who is either famous or has a position of influence. A human being, and telling their story in a way that reaches a policymaker or someone who is a decision maker, to push past their implicit bias and have them stop, just stopping and wondering, am I on the right track? I mean, that usually will cause um, a halo effect of others around them thinking, I hadn't thought that either. So that the storytelling aspect, again, there's a few examples, but I can't overstate how important that is.
Yeah. I definitely appreciate you sharing that, Sam, of those examples of how understanding and incorporating local stories have contributed to the success of your project. Because it certainly seems as though that place public affairs will have a great large focus on leveraging these local narratives. Where do you see the landscape of public affairs evolving in the coming years, and what opportunities or challenges do you anticipate?
I mean, opportunities and challenges. It's in a lot of ways it's easy. It seems like a cop out to say more of this, but just more of this. But in a lot of ways, I think connectivity, the brilliance and the magnificence of the connectivity we have now, and how the world is its own community, and we can develop communities within communities. And we saw that during COVID. We especially see that now. In a lot of ways, COVID peeled back the veil on the inequities that existed in our system. That shame on all of us for not seeing it, but now realizing it. I think connectivity will help us come up with greater solutions and more ways to press back past that. But it's also going to create more of a divide. It's also going to foster more of a sentiment that it's us versus them. And I think a greater focus on that, and a greater realization that there's no finish line, there's no train station. That this is about the journey. This is about staying hyper vigilant consistently. As depressing as that might seem, that's what it
Yeah.
is. It's focusing on this in a way that, even if it seems like things are settling, or seems like things, are finally we just have to stay hyper vigilant and stay focused on moving the ball forward. And you know, uh, I think with a lot of that, it's interesting thinking about the campaigns that I've been on and how technology has transformed and changed. But
Oh
again,
yeah.
the approach has always been the same. Storytelling is a kid seeing. There's a reason that on a political campaign there's a pre-program. I think some people think it's to fire the crowd up. It's to have people not go from wandering around and looking at their friends or their phones, or back then just conversations, and having and realizing, oh, we're starting. I mean, that's just pageantry. That's part of it from a campaign perspective. But it's a validator. There's a reason the pre-program is made of people who live in those communities. Back to what we talked about: basketball players, mayors, pastors at churches. There's a reason, because they become a validator. So in a lot of ways, that never changed. That's always been the way to move change forward. I like to say a place for change. In a lot of ways, it's the places where people live. But I think it's that. It's a realization that we just have to stay hyper focused, and have to continue moving the ball forward in a way that is thoughtful and with everyone's best interests at heart. And I mean, even to say that, though, I'm going to contradict myself, but to say everyone's interests at heart, part of the concept of place is to figure out what those interests are and why they exist. If you look at companies, and again, people with great interest and the best of intentions going in to try and um, help African American mothers have better access to care, they have to first to invoke the idea of digital divide, or education divide, or healthcare access gap, to invoke that. And to come back to answering your question, I think we need a greater understanding and a greater focus on. To do that, you also have to recognize the system is broken. You also have to say, well, these are the reasons. Yes, this gap exists, and here are the reasons they exist, and shame on us, but now we're going to try and do something about it. And I think to get past the more of this, and the more of this also, is being more thoughtful with how we're going into communities, to not just throw essentially gasoline on a piece of concrete and light it, that inevitably is going to burn out and go back to being a piece of concrete, and leave it in more of a sustainable way. Again, not just throwing money at it or throwing resources at it, but giving money and resources to the influencers who then can also fundraise, because they know how to do that now, and make it more of a sustainable approach at the community level. So it I think moving forward, it's just going to get more hyperbolic and more amazing, just on, again, contextualizing in a greater way.
I certainly appreciate that, Sam, about you just sharing that vision, using storytelling to empower women in diverse communities. Just as far as when it comes to you, compared to your peers or colleagues in the public affairs arena or similar arenas in the realm of politics, what do you think makes you stand out compared to them? Not even necessarily competitively, but even if it's just by inch, what unique perspective do you feel you bring to public affairs that maybe your friends or your colleagues or peers who have similar agencies or work for Congress or who may be lobbyists or just similar like-minded individuals may have?
It's a great question. Thank you for that. I mean, A lot of it is just the experience I've had through my life of working on multiple campaigns, getting to go all over the country and meet a lot of people, building a pretty sizable network across the U.S. of influencers, frankly, on both sides. You spend your life, but I think it's interesting you raised that. In 2004, after the 2004 campaign, I actually started a company then as well with my father, who, as I mentioned, grew up in politics with him. Um, didn't have the network that I have now, didn't have the connectivity that I have now through digital, through LinkedIn, through different channels to reach people or activate people, um, and didn't have the experience. But now all those things coming together, I think what sets maybe me apart, but place apart for sure is many public affairs agencies that will work with a company who need to move something forward, move their consumers forward, move a policymaker that is considering obstacles or barriers forward. Many times those companies will have many testimonials of advocates, patient advocates, consumer advocates. They just need to activate and don't have the knowledge or the bandwidth to do so. That's definitely something that we are very good at and can do. But having the network and having the ability to reach into communities and say, okay, well, now I understand the kinds of experiences and stories you need to activate to do that. We can find those individuals, whether it's Detroit, whether it's LA, or whether it's New York or Des Moines. We can go anywhere and go up to scale through a network that we have on the ground of field teams and influencers and campaign managers for corporate or associations or campaigns. A grassroots campaign in one county in Iowa versus a field campaign across 15 different states. I think what makes us different is that we can spin up to do that with our network on the ground. But in a lot of ways, I go back to the power of place. This isn't this. I'm going to say something that is unique to me, but not because I'm the only one. There are many other colleagues I have at other agencies that are good at this as well. But empathy and the understanding of how to see another person's side and put yourself in their shoes, even if there's no way you could ever fathom what it feels like, but you're open to at least understanding that it's a horrible situation to be in when the system is set up to fail you and you've had to press through it over and over and over again. Just to be open to realizing that's a thing. I mentioned African American mothers before. In the U.S., African American women die in childbirth at a greater clip than any other country in the world, developed or not. That is, and to be able to understand, okay, I'm never ever going to be able to understand what that's like, but I know it's wrong, and I know a lot of people across the U.S. that I could reach out to, and I tend to say industry words like activate, and that sounds too clinical. In a lot of ways, reaching out to some of these individuals or these communities is not about activating them. It's also about saying, look, you have a voice and you deserve to have it heard. Some of them may have already tried to speak up and nobody would listen, or they didn't have the right channel or the right resources. Others might not have the confidence or the realization that they actually are capable and should have a voice. So in a lot of ways, the approach that we take when we reach out to our network, which is unique because it's across the entire US, is to not say, hey, I have a client that really is trying to get this policymaker to do this. If I write an op-ed, can I place it in your name? It's about starting with, you have a voice that should have a greater platform. You deserve that. The system has failed you over and over again. I have an opportunity where a client I have or a campaign I'm working for is actually trying to make a difference and make it better. Again, to give you a voice so you can speak on behalf of something that you should have the right and the platform to do regardless. And along the way, it will help my client as well. But starting with a genuine approach like that is that's something that really sets us apart, because again, it's not just chess pieces. It's starting
Right.
with the concept of going to places where people live to give them a voice that also helps the purposes that our clients are trying to move forward. And I talked about allyship before. I mean, I grew up in rural America, and
Right.
I've lived in DC for over 25 years, and that dichotomy of understanding what it's like to be in a geographically underserved area, but also living in an area where I've focused on policies my whole life to try and fix the system that's set up to fail a lot of human beings, it's an interesting disparate, intrinsic. There are ways you could frame it as just kind of the polar opposites and everything in between. But I truly believe that I am my brother's keeper. I truly believe that I should step up and help others. My wife and I talked to 13 and 11. I can't be more proud of of my sons. They're very, very focused on purpose and leaving the world in a better place. Especially my 11-year-old, which is amazing because he's 11.
Yeah.
I'll hear conversations with some of his friends, and someone said something derogatory, and he said, "Hey, you can't say that. That's not right. That's mean, and it's not right." And I just thought to myself, how did I get so lucky to have a kid who's is already that thoughtful? But that really sets us apart. And I think in a lot of ways, starting with that approach, it's not just showing up to be able to convince a person. It's showing up to be able to give a person a voice or a community a voice that they should already have in line with what the interests of the clients are. Is a connection it's very powerful and it's unique.
Absolutely, for sure. And you've mentioned this already, but without having you repeat yourself too much, what are your key values in driving motivations? You mentioned empathy and all, but what other key values and driving motivators do you have within yourself that keeps you going every day?
I mean, not to uh, seeing from different perspectives the world through other people's eyes, and how um, that can be magical. It can be a form of I'm a big food person, so it's a unique flavor when you see a different perspective. But I'm a huge believer again in leaving the world a better place than we came into it as. But another driver is innovation. I mean, I love the idea of moving something forward that's never been moved forward, or moving something forward that's been challenging to move forward. And time again, seeing again communities that have to press through barriers just to get to what everybody else is handed, or to what white men are handed, increasing their adaptability quotient and their emotional intelligence. Those are the underpinnings of innovation. Again, and I think what drives me is trying to prove to clients or show to clients and other colleagues and influencers that there's this gap where people are saying there's an innovation gap. There's a talent dearth. There are all these tech jobs that we can't find people to fill. And I just want to shake people and say, have you looked at this good at these jobs, but would be better than most human beings? If you can bridge those things and have them come together and create more accessible pipelines to education, to retraining, it's just so powerful. But it moves innovation forward. And on a personal level, growing up on a farm, my grandparents were incredible. My grandfather, who fought World War II, was one of the few that volunteered to stay home, to stay in Germany after um, the war ended, to essentially liberate the death camps. And that, hearing that as a kid, and he was a devout Catholic, and just very, very thoughtful about the community. That's always, I don't know what it is. It's hard to pinpoint. It's very ethereal, but it does not feel right to not step up and try and move the world forward in a more positive way. And that's one of it's probably the most singular driver of my motivations. I also like food and rock and roll, but that's a whole nother conversation.
That's good. You mentioned your family. You mentioned that you have a lovely family with your kids and wife, and just mentioned your grandparents. Who are your role models? Aside from them, if those are your role models, that's great. But do you have any other role models that have inspired you in the past or even presently?
I mean, I said my grandfather before, and but it's going to sound so cheesy to say
All
Barack
good.
Obama, but I mean,
It's
on
all
that
good.
campaign, I remember the moment. It was actually in Philly. I remember the moment when I realized it was real. I had been in the primary with a different candidate, and luckily having grown up in politics and having a lot of friends on lots of campaigns. The moment that he dropped out, I went straight to the Obama campaign, but still suffered a bit from the. It's pretty amazing, but like all this hope and change, like this has got to be a talking point. He can't really believe all these things to his core. And when we were in Philly, the last rally that day, the crowd started chanting Obama in a way that just it literally hurt my ears. I had to cover my ears. It looked like I was blocking my ears because I was bored or something, but it literally hurt. And it was this, oh, like he really believes in moving the world forward, and believes that he can, and that we can do it if we all do it in solidarity. And that just, ever since then, as I said, in that experience in Philly with those four rallies, that's really where the idea of the power of place just really started to grow within me. And that I mentioned Arnie Duncan as well. I mean, former Secretary Duncan, he's another one that just is focused on focusing on what is most important and not wasting time on the things that aren't, and trying to, he goes into prison and talks to kids and say, how did you get here? What caused you to be here? Was it the school to prison pipeline? Was it not being able to afford food? What caused you to be here? To try to figure out how to get guns off of the street. um, he is another one. And in a lot of ways, everybody says their parents, but my parents, my mom grew up on a farm. My dad worked for Carter, and throughout our lives, they both have,
Awesome.
also been committed to equity and thoughtfulness. And this is going to be the super cheesiest, but my wife, I mean, my wife is, I married way up. I'm very, very lucky. And she's focused on creating a life for us, and also a world where not just a world where our kids can thrive, but kids that will want to make the world thrive. So it's, that's probably horribly cheesy that I said my wife, but it's true. So
No worries. What advice would you give to aspiring professionals, particularly women and minorities, looking to make an impact in the field of public affairs? Because I do believe that there is an increasing need, if not more than ever, to have these representative groups in public affairs, having their own public affair firms, having minority owned media spaces. From your perspective, what gems would you just drop to just those individuals who are looking to do exactly or similarly to what you have done throughout your life and what you're doing now with Place Public Affairs, who want to have these firms, these agencies, or these consultant groups where they can make the impact being someone from those representative groups?
work on a campaign, full stop. Work on a campaign. Doesn't have to be a presidential, doesn't have to be a Senate race, doesn't even have to be a mayoral race. Advocacy in some form. It can be a race for, the school district is moving the school up the street into a different neighborhood, and you want to push back on the school system. It can be, your best friend is running for student body president. It can be, a larger movement in a state where there's an apparatus in place that you can join and go door to door. GOTV, knocking on doors, talking to people face to face. Essentially, connectivity is one of the most powerful drivers of human motivation. So just getting on a campaign, but the solidarity that comes from that really is what, I was thinking about when I said that. When you're in the foxhole with people who care about the world in a very, very powerful but also unforgiving way, um, your own solidarity starts to grow, your network starts to grow, you start to build your family, so to speak. And for anyone wanting to get into public affairs or advocacy, the election night can be a presidential. You're volunteering at your county precinct, and the night before election, you're knocking on doors, or during the actual election, you're at a precinct and you're helping people with ballots, or helping people. You're standing on the corner and saying the school's this way, even though it looks like it's not. I mean, jumping in and being an advocate in some way, shape, or form. That's the from my perspective, that's what someone told me once, and it's continued to be the most important and most valuable lesson for me as far as getting into advocacy and staying in advocacy has been. That's an easier one to do, so to speak. Another one would be see the world from another person's perspective, and in a hard way. Try to see the world either by reaching out to someone, or if you're not comfortable with that, just doing your own research and trying to figure out what are the reasons that a person thinks in a way and in a view about the world that is diametrically opposed to me in a way that quite literally offends me. What are the reasons? What are the drivers? Try to get inside their head or understand the shoes that they've walked in, the life that they've had. Um, but it also doesn't mean that they're implicitly wrong or holistically wrong. So seeing the world through someone else's lens, that becomes a powerful driver back to adaptability and emotional intelligence. The more you do that, the more you can do that. And again, that's not so much for the purposes of seeing what, in my case, a Democrat who grew up in rural America. It's not trying to figure out what a Republican in the city thinks. It's just about someone with views that are not your own. It doesn't even have to be political. I mean, I love, I outside of a brief stint as a lead singer in a rock band,
Oh, nice.
near college, I've stayed in politics my whole life, but I still love rock and roll. I'm actually singing a rock and roll band. It's something that it's on a personal level. It it motivates me and moves me and energizes me in ways that very few other things can. And there are other forms of music that I don't disparage, but I can't even fathom why people like it. And I make when I come across something like that on Sirius XM or Pandora, or look at the history of the music. How did it come to be? Why could a person like this? Many times I'll understand it. Sometimes I actually become a fan of that music. Sometimes I say, bless their heart, it's not for me. But
Yeah,
understanding that will allow you to understand that on so many other levels. And again, being an advocate and building a network through being an advocate and being able to see the world through other people's shoes so you can reach them and try to motivate them towards your purpose. Those are the two most important things you can do in public affairs and in advocacy. And that's what I would encourage people to do.
cool, awesome. You mentioned you're from rural Missouri, so just a quick lightning round. Are you a Chiefs fans or are you a Commanders fan? If you follow football, obviously.
I mean, I grew up a Chiefs fan, and oddly in Missouri, you're a Chiefs and a Cowboys fan. So, but that has something to do with the South. And then when I moved to DC in '90 something and started dating my now wife, and she was a big then Redskins fan, and it was pretty clear pretty quickly that I was also going to become a fan.
Right.
So kind of moved over. Definitely, Snyder made it hard to be a Redskins and then a Commanders fan. But now we're really, really excited about the future with Josh. And it's obviously the team is not just the owner, but I have a friend who's the head of the Commanders community, essentially their foundation. And I would always wonder to myself, how is she going into communities and trying to build these bridges and invest or fundraise with an owner who just, was anathema to advocacy, and
Yeah,
how exciting it must be now with an owner who's actually from near DC and cares about this deeply. I mean, that's a long answer of saying Commanders, but I was pretty excited during the Super Bowl, though. I'll tell you that because my
gotcha.
whole family are still Chiefs fans.
Gotcha. You think they're 3P next year?
I mean, that might break the world. Who knows? It'd be cool if they did.
You think Commanders are in the playoffs next year?
What? You're cutting out. What was
Yeah.
that?
You think the Commanders are
I'm
in the
kidding. I'm
playoffs
kidding.
next year?
I'm kidding. I mean, that would be to happen, but I think it's possible. Yeah, I mean, Super
Gotcha.
Bowl may be a bridge too far for now, but there's definitely a lot of positive energy coming towards us now. And it's, to be honest, I'm more of a hockey fan. My kids both play hockey. One plays soccer as well, so we're bigger Caps fans. We're actually going to a
Oh,
Caps
yeah. Nice.
Caps game in a couple weeks, so we're bigger hockey fans than football fans.
Gotcha. It's all good. Well, I definitely appreciate your time today, Mr. Sam Myers. Where can where can audiences learn more about you and your work, or as far as getting in touch with you for any potential projects, initiatives, or collaborations? What's the best way they can follow and get in touch with you?
Honestly, email is easiest, or the website, placepublicaffairs.com. That's just placepublicaffairs.com. And you can log on there and reach me through our portal, or email is the same back end, and it's sam at placepublicaffairs.com. I'm also linked on LinkedIn. I'm not on the other channels as much for myself, but for LinkedIn, I'm on there a lot. So that's Sam Myers Jr. on LinkedIn. Given my father, he is I have his name, which was always fun in politics, and I mean that it was a lot of fun to be Sam Myers Senior and Sam Myers Jr. and share moments with him. We had a moment at the UN General Assembly in 2016 where it was him. Dad was Biden's trip director for 8 years, so it was Biden, Obama, me, Dad, and then President Obama's trip director at that point, and then the U.S. ambassador from state for protocol. Just the six of us, and everybody knew everybody. And I remember thinking to myself, how in the heck are two people from rural Missouri standing in a room with the two most powerful people in the world, and we all know each other? That's a testament to frankly, to my father and all that he's done in politics over the years that really, gave me a platform that I didn't have, and gave me the ability to open doors that I wouldn't have otherwise been able to open. I've kept them open, and I've grown in a lot of ways on my own, but I got off track again. I got excited about that
Well,
story.
good. I
Popped
love
into
it.
my
I love it. I love it. No apologies at all. I'm definitely looking forward to all the upcoming initiatives and the projects that Place Pu- public affairs has and all the interest that you have going on. You certainly have a supporter and new friend in me, and would love to stay in touch and see if we could possibly collaborate on some project initiatives down the road, especially this year, if you're up for that.
I would love that. And honestly, I was looking at your background. I mean, you talking about my Missouri to DC. I mean, you're North Carolina and California. I mean, you understand that. You understand
Yes,
that dichotomy in ways that it can really get to innovation because you're living different perspectives, dual perspectives, more than just two to say dual. But I would love to collaborate and get to know you better. And I'm sure we'll talk again soon.
absolutely. I've lived all over the place. I've lived in New York, New Jersey, Florida, London, Paris, and now here in North Carolina. I've traveled a whole bunch, worked on so many races from municipal, dog catcher, judicial, state legislator, gubernatorial, congressional, and presidential, and so many other advocacy projects all in between over the last 15, 20 years myself. I may not look that old, but I'm in my mid 30s, but I've been involved in politics, as I like to say, at least from a community block level since I was 16 years old for, John Kerry, Kids for Kerry and all of that. But I've always been interested in politics since I was like 12 years old. Bush v. Gore was my first real entryway of really staying involved and really wanting to work into politics. So I was actually upset I couldn't even vote in the year 2000 at the age of 12. So I couldn't wait till
That's
I turned
amazing.
18.
That's
True story.
amazing.
True story. We could talk about that offline much later. But Sam, thank you again. I'm going to be respectful of your time, and I will send you a debrief email in just a little while today.
Sounds great. Thanks again for reaching out, Clay, and have a great weekend. And I'll see you soon.
All right. Take care now. I'll talk to you later.
Great. Bye bye.